The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Today we're going to begin by talking about Saint Benedict. We, in a previous episode, talked about his twin sister, Scholastica. So let's talk about Benedict, his life, where was he born, and some of the facts about him.
Well, again, born in Italy in the year 480, the twin of Scholastica. What's interesting to note also is that they die 1 year apart. Scholastica dies first, and we spoke about her fervent prayer that he would not leave her before she died. We know that, as we mentioned, Scholastica is kind of the foundress of women's religious orders, monasticism, around the time of the end of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century, but it is Benedict that we think of more in that founding of monastic communities, the founding of the Benedictines, bringing together men of common purpose and common faith to live together, to pray together, to serve in a variety of roles. And that's what we really see is that they care for the earth, they grow their own food, they keep of animals for their nourishment, but then they go out and they celebrate Mass, they continue to teach and preach that journey of Christ.
What's interesting, and we really didn't mention this when we talked about Saint Scholastica, but these twins were born to wealthy parents, and yet we find them wanting to kind of flee this life of pageantry and royalty and wealth to go into a communal life of probably poverty. And we know that in the lives of many of the saints throughout the history of the Church. St. Francis comes to mind, who also was born in a royal family of wealthy parents who decided to let it all go and to go to a life of poverty. So there's this call that actually happens in his life. And so there's a sense of removing oneself from the worldliness of this planet and finding harbor and refuge in the world of God himself. And it reminds me of that whole sense that Paul says that we are to be of this world, but not of this world. Mm-hmm. So there's that whole sense that we really have a dual citizenship. We're citizens of this world, we're also citizens of the kingdom. And in our lives as Catholic Christians, at least as adult Catholic Christians, is to try to find some medium where we could be good citizens of the earth and of the world and good citizens of the kingdom as well. That dichotomy is not always easy in the lives of Catholic Christians. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And even as we look at some of the saints, there are some who are of wealth and privilege, even nobility, who continue in that role, but recognize the need to serve the poor. They usually receive great opposition from many who say that they're betraying the way in which their class or their order is to live. But then there are those like Francis, like Benedict and Scholastica, who they just don't feel that they can even remain part of that community. That it's not just about having wealth, but sharing it with the poor. It's about identifying with the poor so much that you strip yourself of all of that. We hear the story of Francis that he literally strips himself of all of his earthly possessions. One of the things that we know about Benedict is that in addition to the wealth and the opulence, he just is witness to such corruption. The ways in which people are gaining their wealth, that they're gaining their prestige, and how at every step of the way that corrupt sense of gaining for oneself is always at the expense of someone else. And usually it's at the expense of those who are considered the least in society. And so it is for that main motivating reason that he feels that it's not just in having wealth and sharing it, but he can't be part of that anymore. And so that's why he really receives that great call to remove himself completely from that. and to go and identify with those who have been so mistreated and so left out of society at the expense of others.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking, what came to mind is that whole sense of monastic life. Sometimes we look upon that as an anomaly, that it's something that no one should ever do. But in this world, in this day and age, we do need those people who spend life in prayer, life in constant worship and praise to God, because that really benefits those people who do not pray. And let's face it, in this world, prayer sometimes might be at a minimum in the lives of our hectic and complexing world and lives that we live. So it's really important to lift up those people who find a call in the monastic life. We know in the 21st century we have various communities of men and women religious who spend life in the monastic order. And their whole life is surrounded not only in communion with one another, but in prayer, in constant prayer to God. And so I think that is really a vital part of the church and the structure of the church, that we have those people whose whole life is dedicated to praying to God. You know, as we look at our hectic life, even as diocesan priests, you know, it's important for us to take that time to spend it in prayer. And oftentimes that time comes whether it's a weekday mass or weekend mass, and throughout the day we don't always have those moments or times where we could stop to offer prayer to God. You know, I often find in my own personal life in the car where I'm the most impatient that I really need to take that time to focus, to recall God's presence, to know that moment of sometimes what can be a frustrating travel is really a time that I can offer up as prayer. And so it's important for us to recognize that in the life of the church, there are those who devote and dedicate their entire life to prayer. Anything else in one final minute that we have that we'd like to close for the folks that are with us about St. Benedict?
Well, I think in addition to his dedication to worship and to prayer, one of the things that with his religious community he is most known for is the rule of St. Benedict. That he really, and this then becomes part of what other religious communities do, and that's why when we look at the kind of the founding of monastic communities, that they live by a rule, that there's a variety of, we don't want to say laws or guidelines, but this is their rule. One of the great calls of Benedict, as we close too, was that in prayer, in worship, in ministry and service, this sense of hospitality, this service to all in need. And one of the great, to paraphrase it, great calls is, you know, hospitality to all who enter, and to treat them as you would treat Christ himself, really becomes that hallmark of the Benedictine community and then all religious communities.
We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say, thinking of her. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together.
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about two other saints, Cyril and Methodius. You know, we know that they're very famous for their feast being celebrated on St. Valentine's Day, but they really have nothing to do with St. Valentine. But let's talk about Cyril and Methodius and who they were and what was some of the things that surrounded their faithful life.
Well, first, they were blood brothers. They were related through their parents. They were born in Thessalonica, Greece. One was a priest, Cyril was a priest, and Methodius is a monk. So they're both involved in religious life. And as we've just talked about St. Benedict, it's interesting to also note that together with Benedict, they serve as the co-patrons of all of Europe. And so while they might not be overly known to everybody, they are certainly part of that great growth of the early church. And are part of a great legacy and tradition of faith. One of the things where they would be very well known is that they become, we've talked about apostles, they become the apostles to the Slavs. Mm-hmm. And we'd mentioned that apostles go out and reveal that personal, intimate relationship with the Lord to certain groups of people. That was the call of the first apostles. They all went forth to different regions, different lands. We've talked about, Patrick is the apostle to Ireland. Well, Cyril and Methodius are the apostles to the Slavs. And so they are very well known and very much honored by Slavic people. There probably isn't a diocese around, at least in older dioceses, that had waves of Eastern European immigrations that doesn't have at least one, if not a couple, churches that were named after Cyril and Methodius because of the Slavic people and their great devotion to them.
And I think as we talk about the Slavic community, we know that like the Mediterranean community, the Slavic community is very firm and very strong in their Catholic faith. And obviously this was bolstered and supported and nurtured through Cyril and Methodius. It's interesting that these blood brothers really worked together to bring about the kingdom. And what an important facet it is in family life, to have families, siblings working together to carry on a mission. We talked about that briefly with Benedict and Scholastica, twins. We talk about it now with Cyril and Methodius. We know that in the lives of a few other saints, as brothers and sisters, or as aunt and niece, that they work together to work for the building up of the kingdom. It's interesting because we know that Cyril and Methodius really created the language, the written language that the Slavs use, the Cyrillic language, and how important and significant it is. There are some other things that are important about the life of Cyril and Methodius that we'd also like to mention. We know that Methodius himself was ordained a bishop. And he died in 885. His brother had died several years prior to that. So there's this whole sense that throughout their life, they worked together to spread the good news of the kingdom, especially to those people who were of a different language and of a different nationality. And how important it is for us to know that God's message is for all people, not just those that are like us or talk like us or think like us, but for all people.
Well, and certainly, as you said, the development of the Cyrillic language, that in itself is an example and a reminder that the church is very much part of, we've talked about not of this world, but of this world, that the church is very much part of society in every age and every generation. And the church has been responsible for a great many advancements in society, a great many of the developments of how people are treated, how they're educated, how they are cared for in healthcare, how young children were cared for, and where we used to have orphanages and then group homes. That the church has always been on the forefront of embracing different aspects of society and helping to nurture and promote society along with the language, and not just in being able to translate the Bible into a language that the Slavic people could read, but allowing them to communicate, allowing them to advance their knowledge and wisdom with other communities and to allow that global community kind of to shrink that we're living in. We see that so much with technology, but it was always the work and always the advancement to bring people together. And certainly Cyril and Methodius were part of that great mission and ministry in the church. We could call it a byproduct, but I think it was a great part.
It's interesting, like some 16 years after Cyril died, that Methodius died. But what's also interesting in the life of Methodius is that he was a monk, and yet he was called to be a bishop. Mm-hmm. And so it's really rather strange that someone who would be in the monastic life, closed off from people, would be called to serve in public life in the church. And so that must have said something a lot about his dedication to sharing the message of God, his ability to do that, his sanctity, the way that he perhaps governed in the monastery. But what's also interesting is that we know that his funeral liturgy when he died was conducted both in Latin, Greek, and the Slavic language. And so that says something about how when the faithful gathered to celebrate his entrance into eternal life, that everyone that was there understood and knew what was going on because they heard some of their own language, and how important it is for us to really get into celebrating the liturgy. We know that with Vatican II, the Mass was changed from Latin into the vernacular. And so the faithful had an opportunity to witness and worship in their own language. And how important that is in the life of the church today to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
You know, we're going to talk about another saint in just a moment, but we've got about a minute left. Anything that we'd like to share with the folks that are with us? And I go back to my opening statement about their feast day is February 14th, Valentine's Day, even though they have really nothing to do with St. Valentine's or Valentine's Day. They do talk about the love of God and how important it is to share that love of God with others.
Absolutely, but I think it's also a reminder to people who are watching this series that while we delve into the lives of the saints or the feasts of the church, there's always that broader knowledge. And one of the reminders is that for most of the saints, the feast day in which we celebrate them is the day they died, or as close to as possible. There might be another feast. And that while secular society certainly has made a great deal and an important deal of St. Valentine, that Cyril and Methodius hold a much stronger and a more prominent place in the church, leading people to God, and so their feast is celebrated on that day.
We'll talk about another saint in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty, and as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years for volunteer chore service for Catholic community services. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes. I do work from shopping to housework to yard work. Most of the people I see don't really have a lot of family, so then I become almost like their family.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten. And that's unfortunate because they're a real important part of our community because they have so much wisdom to share.
Doing this type of work is very rewarding. You can't put it into words because I learn so much from these people, and you learn stuff about yourself too. You learn to see God in a variety of people, in a variety of settings. The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. Now we're going to talk about the Feast of the Chair of Peter. It's really an interesting feast that we celebrate on February 22nd. We have several feasts of St. Peter, coupled also with St. Paul, but this is a feast that's primarily for him and his authority as the Pope of Rome. So let's talk about what the Chair of Peter actually means.
Well, first, as we mentioned briefly in our last segment, that most feasts of saints are celebrated on the day they died on earth, but their entrance into the kingdom of heaven. With Peter and Paul, who at times opposed one another, but really are instrumental in the early church, they have a shared feast day on June 29th. But unlike other saints, we also honor them in perhaps their most significant role in the church. And so we've talked before about the conversion of St. Paul. Certainly that would be a great moment for us in the life of Paul. We celebrate for Peter the chair of St. Peter. That sense of his, as you said, his authority as the Bishop of Rome, as the Pope of the Catholic Church. And we see that chair, the word cathedra, where we get cathedral, we see that sense of power, that sense of authority, that sense of teaching also. An important part of a chair was that for the early Greek philosophers, they would be seated on a chair and their disciples would be gathered around them as they would teach. And so that became the teaching position as well. So authority and teaching in the church as it resides in Peter and then in all of the popes to follow.
And of course, let's carry that to the diocesan church. We know that in all cathedrals, there is what we call the cathedra, or the bishop's chair. So even from that chair, the local bishop governs his flock. If we go back to the feast of Saint of Peter, the chair of Peter, I remember when being actually in the Vatican on February 22nd for the feast, they have this beautiful bronze depiction of Peter sitting in a bronze chair. And then his lower foot is about the height of someone, if they're standing, to be able to kiss it or to touch it. And so that foot over these many centuries has been worn off by the faithful touching it or kissing it. And so it's important, at least in the lives of Italian Catholics, on that feast of the Chair of Peter on February 22nd, to make a special pilgrimage to St. Peter's at the Vatican to touch the foot or to kiss the foot of St. Peter. We know that legend tells us that the actual chair of Peter the Apostle, the first pope, is really encased in Bernini's spectacular depiction of the throne of the chair of the apostle that's depicted directly behind the baldacchino at St. Peter's at the Vatican. So there's this whole art and worship that's in celebration that surrounds the feast that we celebrate on the 22nd. Let's go back to talking about the Pope and the Pope's authority. We call the Pope the Vicar of Christ. We know that the Pope also has different titles that he's given in particular as his role, but what does it mean when we say that the Pope is the Vicar of Christ?
Well, certainly he is, for lack of other words, he is Christ's personal representative here on earth. As the Vicar of Christ, he speaks in the name of Jesus, he acts in the name of Jesus, and as Jesus did while he walked this earth, his great call is to bring others into that mission and into that ministry. As you said, there's many other titles, and as we also look at this feast of the chair of St. Peter, again, while we know that the chair is legendary, included in there in the Vatican, that it's not simply celebrating a piece of furniture, but as we've already alluded to, it is that teaching and that authority. And one of the great titles of the Pope, and where he really derives his authority, is that he is the Bishop of Rome. And so he serves as the head of all the other bishops. And you mentioned that then moves down even to our diocese at St. Columba Cathedral. Again, there is a chair that only Bishop Murray uses when he celebrates Mass. If a priest is having Sunday Mass or a daily Mass or is celebrating someone's funeral, another presider's chair is brought in because that chair is reserved for the bishop himself. That is a physical sign of his governance and his teaching authority within the church.
We've got about 3 minutes left of our show today. Let's go back to that whole idea of the succession of the apostles. We know that our present Pope now is a successor of Peter the Apostle, and how important in the life of the Catholic Church that we see that that has been handed on, that has been celebrated historically in the life of our church. Of course, we go back to the fact and the reality that our church was founded by Jesus himself. And we call it not just the Catholic Church, but the Church of Jesus Christ. And so the foundation was not just on the apostles, but primarily on Jesus, who commissioned the apostles to go out and to spread the good news of the kingdom. And so we see that really, I believe it's in Matthew's gospel, where the apostles are commissioned to go out to the whole world and to spread the good news. And so we see that happening in the life of the early apostles. We see that happening in the life of all of those who are called to ministry in the church. And we see how that continues not only in the life of the hierarchy, but in particular in the life of the faithful. And how important is that for us and for all faithful to continue on the mission of Jesus in the church?
Well, and every Holy Father from Peter on to our current Holy Father, Pope Francis, certainly is shaped and formed by their own lives, by their own experiences. They may feel certain charisms and want to highlight certain activities and certain missions of the church. We see that in Francis's great call to charity. Now, when we focus on that, that does not mean that there has never been a pope until Francis who's focused on charity. And by highlighting that, what we see in the church is this beautiful succession. Now, there have been moments of strife and turmoil, even in the succession of popes in the life of the church. But for the vast majority of the life of the Catholic Church, there has been this continual building upon one another. Sadly, we see in political life that usually when one party gets in, their whole emphasis is to destroy everything that the party before them had built. But sure enough, that party's going to get back in at some point, and then they're going to destroy everything or remove everything or change everything. And then you have a society that's constantly at odds with itself. In the church, it's not that way. Even if a pope feels a greater charism to go in one direction, there's never this overt destruction of what another Holy Father has done. It is always this gradual building and this gradual moving. And that's why one of the other great titles of the Pope is the Pontiff. He is the bridge builder. There's always that building of that bridge. We never blow up the bridge. We never destroy the bridge. We never close off the borders to the bridge. But it's always this gradual moving forward, cherishing and treasuring the past, but moving toward the future. And that really is the work of each Pope individually, but has been their succession for these many years.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.